Buddy. Okay, so we've been doing a lot of benchmarking the last couple days, and I do have results. So I want to try and go through them in a way that's at least reasonably time efficient and stuff. It's a lot of data, and I don't really know how to present it on the forums. I do have a post where I've sort of presented that I'm doing these experiments. I wrote a little tool, the iRacingDataLogger, to help profile what's going on. And then I've run a whole bunch of benchmarks with the old 5600X CPU and the new 5800X 3D. Just for a recap for anybody who's seeing this for the first time, I did write this little data logger. It's on GitHub if you want to go take a look. You can grab the source code yourself, as well as a release with the binaries and everything that you need to run it if you just want to run it out of the box. It's a little console application. I wrote it to work with a replay. So the idea is you start up a replay, you start the data logger, you play a replay sequence, you stop the data logger, you look at the output. It's all just comma separated values with the iRacing frame rate, background CPU, foreground CPU, GPU utilization as the primary values. And that produces, you can use in Sheets or Excel or whatever you want to make a graph and just sort of visualize what's going on with frame rate and the CPU and GPU utilizations. So to cut to the chase, and also I've been putting everything that I've been doing so far on a Google Drive folder, which is just publicly shared. So if you want to follow along or get a look at the data yourself or disagree with any of the assertions that I make, I encourage you to take a look. The data and everything, all the charts, all the graphs, all the CSV files, as well as the comparison stuff analysis that I've tried to do. It's all here in Google Drive. Have at it. To cut to the chase, the TLDR is that it does not make a significant difference. With iRacing, the way I run the Pimax VR headset with a 3090 GPU, the difference between 5600X and the 5800X 3D is not significant. There's one case where it seems like 5800X 3D does get a little bit closer to running 90 hertz at frame rate in the 110 Steam VR resolution, but that's the only case where it seems like, yeah, it's better. Everywhere else, there might be little gains, but it's so close to negligible or so close to what I would even consider reasonable as a difference between, measurement runs, that it's hard to say definitively, yes, it's better. So I can't say that. When I'm running, or when I've ran with the 5600X, 110 Steam resolution, that's a really large resolution. That's 10,488 by 3,524 for both eyes. That's a pretty insanely large resolution. But that's the standard resolution that I've been running for a long time. And in that resolution, at 75 hertz, I can afford all of the iRacing options that I care about, except for HDR. And it would be nice to be able to run it in slightly higher resolution. Motivation for that is 120% would be around the sort of mathematical sweet spot for the native panel resolutions and stuff in the display, and I can't quite afford that. But switching to the 5800X 3D, I can't run with higher frame rate or resolution or enable HDR and have the same amount of stability and headroom that I do right now in the 110 resolution. So it's not worse, but it's not sufficiently better. And I think it's clear going through the experiments and stuff that I'm just totally GPU bound for the most part, which I kind of knew in the back of my mind, but I also was curious about to know for sure. There's a number of times where, and we'll see some interesting questions as far as turning SPS on and off, what the consequences of that are. And the reason I thought I had more potential in increase for CPU headroom was the times that turning SPS off made it seem like things got significantly worse. And I thought, okay, that's shifting more of the load away from the CPU. Maybe it would help to, have a little bit more CPU power. But I'm also not convinced that the 5800X 3D is a stronger CPU. It's got more cores, but it's got a lower stock clock speed than the 5600X. So I think the 3D cache stuff that's the killer feature in it is probably heavily dependent on what kind of routines and processing or calculations are being done. And I don't know whether iRacing just doesn't fit into the category that benefits the most from that, improvement in the architecture or what. So anyway, just wanted to jump the gun a little bit with the TLDR stuff, but let's go through some of the charts. I don't know how to present this on the forums or another media that, is not going to be just totally overwhelming. But to start off with, SteamVR 110 resolution is what I've been running. So that's sort of like the baseline that I wanted to establish with the experiments that I did. So each one of these sheets, this one goes through just the standard 110 comparison. Down here at the bottom, we've got the different sheets for the different runs. So the naming conventions and stuff I did were maybe a little bit dubious, but basically anything that just starts with the frame rate is the old 5600X, and the ones that are prefixed with 38X3D is the new chip. So this is boring. I'm making frame rate. It's just a razor flat edge. It's making 75 hertz. Not a big deal. And this is what I've enjoyed with the 5600X and the 3090 GPU. It makes frame rate in pretty much all series that I choose to participate in. I can run without having to tweak settings and stuff like that, and it's great. So switching to the new CPU, pretty much the same. And I'm willing to ignore little glitch hiccup stuff like that. It does not come through in the headset, and I think it might even be just a difference in measurements. Sometimes when it's clamped at a frame rate, I do see those little dips in the measurement. But like I said, I'm totally willing to overlook those. I think both CPUs completely make 75 hertz frame rate. It is interesting that the 5800X3D does show a slightly lower GPU utilization. I'm not sure why. And it's also interesting that when it's capped at 75 hertz, the CPU is just above whatever that percentage is. So it's like 75%. I don't know what that means. And we'll see some stuff in a second, which does cause me to question a little bit as far as what the measurements are really telling us, because that's fine. And normally I do run with SPS enabled. So the next two experiments are turning SPS off. And for both CPUs, it continues to totally make frame rate. But it's interesting that with each one, like comparing the 5600X with and without SPS, without SPS, it's a little bit heavier or more expensive for the GPU. And same thing for the 5800X3D. It's just a little bit more GPU utilization without SPS, which is counterintuitive for the way I understand SPS is supposed to work. What SPS does is it lets the CPU make one geometry calculation, pass that off to the GPU, and then the GPU takes that and builds the image for both eyes. The idea is that that's shifting off of the CPU and onto the GPU. So I'm confused in these cases when we turn SPS off that the GPU utilization actually goes up a little bit. It's not significant, but it does go up a little bit. So I don't understand. But the first interesting thing we do see is when we switch to 90 hertz. So 75 hertz versus 90 hertz. And it's not quite making frame rate, nearly, but there's certainly dips and stuff. But I think what I do find interesting is that the CPU utilization is significantly lower at 90 hertz than it's reported at 75 hertz. Both cases with both CPUs, the CPU utilization is sort of pegged with the percentage for the frame rate. But when we jump to 90 hertz, the CPU utilization drops. The only sort of speculation I can make of that, and I should go back, I recorded all of these runs on video on Twitch with like the task manager displayed and stuff like that. The only thing I can think of is that the CPU, when it was running at 75 hertz, was running at a lower clock speed. So it had a higher utilization. And then when we jumped to 90 hertz, it actually boosted up and is running at a faster clock rate, and so the utilization is correspondingly lower, even though it's achieving a higher frame rate. But that's a little bit speculative. I don't really know. So in any event, giving up 90 hertz does give us more headroom. And for both CPUs, the 5800X3D here does make better 90 hertz frame rate at 110 SteamVR resolution than the 5600X. And this is like the one case that I can say, yeah, it does look like the 5800X3D is doing a better job at 90 hertz. And it's interesting that with the 5600X, if we turn SPS off, it gets a little better. With the 5800X3D, turning SPS off hurts. So in both of these, SPS on. No, I'm sorry. That's what, yeah. So with the 5600X, it seems like turning SPS off helps, but the 5800X3D benefits from SPS and it suffers when you turn it off. So on the 5600X without SPS versus the 1500X3D with SPS, it does look like the 5800X3D just barely is a little bit better. So that's like the one case. If we move on away from just the standard set of options that I normally run and enable HDR, we go into a world of hurt effectively. If you look at the difference between, this is what it looked like without HDR, and that's like what it is with HDR. We're obviously utilizing more GPU. And in this case, it looks like the 5600, oops, yeah. In this case, it looks like the 5600X is a little bit better than the 5800X3D. So just like the standard, both of these are with SPS enabled. If we turn SPS off, both of them suffer. Like there's a lot more noise. The frame rate is not clamped as clearly. So it seems like in both cases, the SPS version is more stable. And it does look like the 5600X is a little bit more consistent with less noise than the 5800X3D with HDR enabled. If we jump up to 90 hertz, we again see the slightly paradoxical situation where before at 75 hertz, it looks like the GPU or the CPU utilization is just about 75. But when we jump to 90 hertz, it drops and has obviously a different contour. So again, it's a little bit weird to me that when we switch to 90 hertz and we're obviously making more frame rate, the CPU utilization is reported as lower. But it's also interesting if you look at the contour of the GPU utilization, it's pretty consistent between the 75 hertz and the 90 hertz. So comparing the two processors, 90 hertz on the 5600X versus 90 hertz on the 5800X3D, not a tremendous amount of difference that I would call super significant. And in both of these cases, it looks like turning off SPS hurts. I mean, just looking at the raw percentage, the numeric analysis of the average frame rate, both SPS values are low, or both versions are lower once you turn SPS off. So in this case, the difference between the 5600X and the 5800X 3D seems really marginal. And I think that's because we're obviously GPU bound and any significant difference in the processors is sort of lost under the rug. Given my choice between these two, I think I would pick the consistencies over the 5800X 3D, but I think it's really pretty much the same. The next comparison jumps up the resolution significantly. So we went from 110, which was already pretty extreme as far as 10,488 by 32 or 3524. The 140 resolution is 11,832 by 3970. It's just probably way too high a resolution to really consider. So when we first look at that, trying to make 75 hertz, it is actually close to it most of the time. Both processors running with SPS do a pretty good job of almost being 75 hertz. Turning SPS off on both of them introduces significantly more noise, and neither of them are making frame rate as consistently. So in both cases there, 140 StreamVR resolution, 75 hertz, SPS appears to help. Now, when we jump up to 90 hertz, this is the first time that we're not seeing the CPU utilization go, tremendously different. But I think at this point, the difference between trying to make 75 hertz and trying to make 90 hertz is pretty much the same as far as what the system's able to produce. It looks to me like at the 75 hertz version, the 5800X3D is just a little bit more stable than the 5600 was, but that's not a whole lot. At 90 hertz, the 5800X with SPS on, I think is slightly better than the 5600X with SPS on, but turning SPS off doesn't help. I mean, it doesn't. Both of them seem to suffer without SPS. But I think both configurations are pretty negligible, and neither comes close to making frame rate. And actually, to reverse what I said just a second ago, I think in this case, when we're totally GPU saturated, the turning off SPS does appear to help just a little bit. So maybe that's back to the original philosophy that with SPS off, it's doing more on the CPU and giving a little bit more headroom for the GPU, but the differences are really pretty minuscule. So when we turn HDR on in 140 hertz, this is where it's just the worst. So we don't even start off close to making frame rate. In the previous, where we were just running 140 resolution, it was still kind of almost making frame rate in both configurations. But when we switch to 140 resolution with HDR, everything goes out the window. Neither processor is making frame rate. And at this point, everything starts to look pretty much the same between the two processors. So I think it's, even more than the last case, we're just totally GPU bound. And any differences between the processors is just sort of lost under the rug. So yeah, a lot of graphs, a lot of benchmarking, but the end result, just to go back to the summary here. I don't think it makes a significant difference with iRacing with the way I run it. There could be other configurations and resolution ranges where it's more prominent, and you might see a more significant benefit. But some of the questions that I came up with during the analysis is that why is the CPU utilization higher when it's capped at 75 hertz when it goes to 90? So the example for that is looking back at our original values where it's clamped at 75 hertz. We're totally making 75 hertz, but our GPU utilization is pretty high. When we jump to 90 hertz, the CPU utilization falls significantly as the frame rate goes up. So that seems weird to me. And like I said, I could imagine that there's a difference between like the clock speed that the CPU is running at. And when we jump to 90 hertz, it gets bumped. And that's the explanation for that. But I don't know. That's just speculation. And why does disabling SPS increase the GPU utilization? Because that's also sort of counterintuitive. It seems like in these cases where we go from with SPS enabled to SPS off, so this is with SPS, that's without SPS. It's not a lot, but it does bump up the GPU utilization, which seems counterintuitive to the way I understand the feature. Why does switching to 90 hertz result in lower overall frame rate and more noise on the CPU and GPU? It seems like removing the 75 hertz cap should show it more, just give it more headroom to show what it can really do, but it appears like it actually hurts performance. So we see some of those in these more severe cases where we're not making frame rate at all. If we look at the comparison between the 5800X3D at 75 hertz and the 58X3D at 90 hertz, I guess I would kind of expect them to be more consistent, but it seems like it's more expensive and the frame rate's not any better, or it's actually a little bit worse running at 90. But that 90 target, I don't really understand in these cases where it's not making even close why that is more expensive. But back to the conclusions. 75 hertz at the 110 resolution with SPS on, both processors seem to be about the same. The 5800X3D does look a little bit better on the GPU load, but it's not significant. 90 hertz in 110, the 5800X3D does look better with SPS on, and that's the one case where I would say they look, that like there's a winner. So just to review that. That's this case, where it seems like the 5800X3D at 90 hertz is actually pretty close to making frame rate consistently, whereas the 5600X3D has more dips. When you turn the SPS off on the 5600X, it gets better. When you turn SPS off on the 5800X3D, it gets worse. So the two cases are SPS on with the 5800X3D and SPS off with the 5600X. But if I had to choose between the two, I would choose the 5800X3D with SPS. So 75 hertz with HDR, looks better on the 5600X with SPS and has slightly less GPU utilization. That's the case here. So 5800X3D with HDR, 5600X just a little bit more consistent. When you jump to 90 hertz with the HDR, it seems like we're just totally GPU bound, and it's pretty much identical with both systems. SPS helps a little bit, but it's not tremendous. Switching to 75 hertz on the HDR at 140. The 5800X3D is a little bit more stable, and both are better with the HDR, or both are better with the SPS. So that's these two cases. $90 Hz with HDR. The 5800X3D with SPS off is just very slightly better than the 5800 with it on, but neither are close to making frame rate. And in the end, with 140 and HDR, it's just off the charts. We're not making frame rate anywhere, and it seems like the GPU is so swamped, any changes in the CPU makes no difference. So it does seem a little bit better without SPS, and that's the one case where that seems to be predominant, but that's what I found. So, like I said, I'm going to try and post, all the links and everything to the forum. I'm not really sure how to do like a more write-up format, because there's 8 graphs with each of these, and trying to like show everything side by side is going to be cumbersome. So I don't know. Anybody who's enthusiastic, I strongly encourage, I'll post the link to the Google Drive. You can see all the comparisons and sheets and stuff for yourself. And maybe you have a different intent.
Sam Catacuzzi knows racing.
Hey, Sam. Maybe you have a different opinion about some of the analysis. I'd love to hear it. That's what we're here for. But anyway, I'm glad that I did the experiment. It was fun to make the tool, and it was actually kind of fun to go through and do all the analyses and collect all the data and stuff. It is, a little disappointing that it's not like, oh yeah, the new processor makes a huge difference and now I can run features that I couldn't run before. Sadly, that's not the case, or at least it's not the practical case for me in the way that I run the game. But on the other hand, 110 SteamVR resolution, 75 Hertz on the Pimax is a totally satisfactory driving experience with the options and stuff that I like to have on. There is obvious debate about whether 90 Hertz is better. What I experienced when I was trying to get 90 Hertz to run consistently for me in the past was that I had to turn so many of the options down to get 90 Hertz to be consistent that it looked worse, even though it was making better frame rate. And in the end, I decided that for me personally, it was better to run with the options enabled that I liked, adjust the resolution so that I had headroom, and go forward with that at 75 Hertz. So that's the way I've been running. And with the new processor, that's probably the way I'll continue to run. But it's also interesting. I think that the other alternative I was considering, instead of getting the 5800X 3D, was to build a new Intel-based PC that would be, probably clearly better in terms of the CPU performance. But I think looking at these results, if I had done that, I'd be even more disappointed, because if I didn't see a significant gain, that would have been a lot more money, and the expense of building a new Intel-based system to reveal that we really are just GPU limited in this situation anyway, would have been more disappointing. So anyway, I'm going to wrap up this for now, yeah, like I said, I'll try and post as much of this as I can to the forum, and if people have input or suggestions or constructive criticism, let me know. So anyway, thanks for watching. Take it easy. Drive safe. I'll see you later. Bye-bye. Pit Girl ends stream.